My name is Lisa Smith, and you are with the YWCA of Hanover and our Enlightening Conversations. I typically start the evening with an introduction about our topic and kind of set the scene a little bit about what we're going to be talking about. But to be quite frank with you, there is so much to cover this evening that I'm going to dispense with that and go right to introducing our speaker. Our speaker this evening is Dr. Todd Allen. He is with Messiah University. He's the Vice President for Diversity Affairs and is also a professor of communication. And Dr. Allen is also the founder of the Common Ground Project, which is a nonprofit dedicated to teaching the history of the civil rights movement. And that's basically our topic for this evening, the civil rights movement. How many of us remember it? There's quite a few of us who do. What do we know about it? And how is it being approached these days in conversation, in curriculum? And what do we need to make sure people know about it? So I am going to turn the whole thing over to Todd to get started, and then we will have questions and go from there. Todd, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, good evening, Lisa. Good to be with you. And thanks again to the YWCA of Hanover for this opportunity. I will jump right in here and prepare to share my screen, if that's okay.
Okay.
All right. Can we see that?
Yes. Beautiful.
Great. Well, again, thank you for this opportunity, and I do hope that we get a chance to get into some conversation as well. Thinking about the civil rights movement today, there's probably not a day in my life since I was a young man that I learned about this chapter in history that I've not had at least one conversation in a day about it. People often ask me, why is it that I'm so passionate about the history of the civil rights movement? When I was coming up through school, particularly high school, and I'm from Western Pennsylvania, a little place called Beaver Falls. I was blessed. Okay, I was blessed with the educational opportunity to have 2 years of study of African-American history and culture. In 9th grade, we went all the way from the continent of Africa through the Civil War. And then to date myself a little bit, in 10th grade, we picked up at Reconstruction and finished somewhere in the era of a different world television show. So if that helps you to figure out to the mid 80s. But I thought that was an experience that every kid in this country had. And it was only when I got to college at Morehouse that I realized what a unique opportunity that I had. I show this image here. This was that history teacher that I had from high school, Mrs. Potter, who taught me that history and went on my very first tour over 21 years ago through the group, the Common Ground Project. And she always says to this day, little did she know that in all those years of teaching, that it would be one of her students who would one day take her to these places where this history happened. And I often say, little did I know when I was learning this as a young man, that one of the things I was being positioned to do was to take people on these journeys. So we've been doing this for 21 years now. And this is obviously an interesting historical moment to be talking about the civil rights movement today, with debates going on around everything from critical race theory to Confederate monuments, to how do we teach history and where does our narrative begin, and what books should be considered in that conversation. When I think about the state of civil rights education in this country, I'm drawn to this report from 2014. And unfortunately, even though it's 2022, I don't think a whole lot has changed in terms of conclusions that the Southern Poverty Law Center reached. But they said, we remain concerned that students are likely to remember only 2 names and 4 words about the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, and I Have a Dream. And that's no disrespect to Dr. King, to Mrs. Parks, but oftentimes we don't even know that information that well. For many, and I know it says young people, but people, this period, I think, as Waldo Martin says, looms as a shining moment in the distant past with little relevance to contemporary issues of race, democracy, and social justice. And as one would know, if you think about this history of the civil rights movement and its relevance today, nothing could be further from the truth that it has little relevance to this present moment. And I look forward to talking about that as well.
Mhm.
At the same time, though, we're having an interesting time in this history where there is a desire to learn a more truthful past. I think back to 2016 with the opening of the National Museum of African American History and Culture that has as its motto and mission the belief that a more inclusive history is a more relevant history. I think one of the places that we see this on our commemorative landscape today is through the work of Brian Stevenson and the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama. This is their Peace and Justice Memorial, often known as the Lynching Memorial. That is also part then of their Legacy Museum, which traces the history of African Americans, particularly from the period of slavery to the current period of mass incarceration. As Brian often says, that slavery didn't end, it just evolved.
Changed.
Yeah. For me, I'm often asked in the 21 years of doing this, do I have a favorite place that I like to go? And I say to people, that's kind of like asking a parent, do they have a favorite child?
Yeah.
If you've got no children or only one child, it's easy to pick one. But if I have to pick one, I do have a fond place in my heart for Selma, Alabama. And one of the reasons is because of the woman in this picture. Her name is Joanne Bland. And Joanne, when she was 11 years old, got involved in the movement in Selma. We particularly know about the events around voting and Bloody Sunday. Joanne, along with her 14-year-old sister, Linda, was on that bridge on March 7th, 1965, was beaten and sprayed with tear gas, all for demonstrating for the right to vote. And what I love about Joanne is just her wisdom and her authenticity in sharing this story. But it also highlights for people that, sometimes we see this, black and white footage or photos, and we think that, well, that was ancient, long, long ago. And we're blessed that many of these people are still with us. And we think that, oh, well, they must have been considerably older when they were involved in this movement. And Joanne, as I said, was 11 years old. Right. This particular picture is very, very special to me because that young man that she's with is my son. And at the time that picture was taken, he was 11 years old. He's now 22 years old. But when I think about this image, I think about some of the lessons of the civil rights movement and some of the challenges of the movement. I wouldn't be a professor if I didn't throw out some challenges and some lessons. Now, I'm just going to do them real quick. First, when I think about the challenges, there is the tension between remembering and forgetting. What do we do with this conflicted past? And we see this quite a bit on the commemorative landscape in Alabama in particular, but in the South more broadly. What do you do when literally you've got the history of Jefferson Davis and the Confederacy and the history of Martin Luther King, all pun intended, intersecting, right? So there's that challenge of the conflicting past. There's the challenge of the loss of places. The late Congressman John Lewis used to say that our history and these sites of our history are a precious resource, and we must do all we can to preserve and protect it. This was an image taken a number of years ago in Mississippi at the site Bryant Grocery Store. And if you, again, know the movement, you know that name. That was where Emmett Till had his encounter with Carolyn Bryant. But we're losing these places. You can see it's literally falling in on the landscape. And as the saying goes, some deeply believe that if we can get places like this out of sight, then they'll be out of mind. And then I think a third challenge, and we've been experiencing this quite a bit in the last decade, is the loss of these authentic voices, the people that made this history. None of us knows how much time we have, but we've been losing a lot of giants of the movement in these last several years. And so while those are challenges, there are some lessons that we can take from these challenges. And I've got three. One is, lesson number one is that the civil rights movement is the story of ordinary people who did extraordinary things. You know, again, we often think of them as heroes and sheroes, and indeed they are. But what I've come to learn in knowing these folk is that they are ordinary people like you and I, who saw an injustice and, as John Lewis said, found a way to get in the way. This is one of my favorite images, again, thinking about young people in the movement. There you see members of the Little Rock Nine, and I love that woman in the center, Minnie Jean Brown. She says, you know, I dare you to find a picture of me at that time. This is when they were integrating Central High School, of me not smiling. Not because it was easy, because it was not, it was hard, but she said my smile was my resistance. I think of a second lesson, and that is that the civil rights movement is a story of sacrifice, with some making the ultimate sacrifice of their lives. This is an image taken from Montgomery at the Southern Poverty Law Center of a memorial to over 40 individuals whose lives were taken during the civil rights movement. Jackie Robinson, who we just celebrated the 75th anniversary of his integration of Major League Baseball, said a life is not important except in the impact it has on other lives. And here we, in spaces such as this, we learn the story of the impact that these lives had on our own. You know, along that line, you know, I said that sometimes people think that there's no relevance to this past, to today. And as I said, nothing could be further from the truth. I often tell people, when you don't know who said something, just say Mark Twain. That sounds really smart. Yeah. And so Mark Twain said, history may not repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. Mm-hmm. And for me, as I explore this history, I see a direct connection from Emmett Till to Trayvon Martin to George Floyd to the young man in Grand Rapids just this past week who was murdered. And then a third lesson that I take from this history is that it is the story of people of faith. And I don't mean just one specific faith tradition, but it's no accident that these people, many of them were people of faith and leaders in their church, and that the movement found its headquarters in churches. I love this image. This is from the former Voting Rights Museum in Selma. It's now moved to a different location. But what I love about this image, you can see the Edmund Pettus Bridge in the background. And on a nice sunny day, you see some names there written on the window. And it reminds me of that passage in Hebrews when we talk about a great cloud of witnesses. And it's as though these people who went on before us are calling out for us today to remain involved in the freedom struggle. You know, talking about people of faith, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about sometimes the false dichotomy that we have of Dr. King. We see him as a preacher and then as a civil rights leader, when really he was a preacher living out the implications of the gospel. One of his contemporaries was asked one time, of all the sociologists and historians and economists and even theologians that King studied, who do you think influenced him the most? And without missing a beat, this person said Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? I remember asking the late Reverend C.T. Vivian one time, Rev, you know, a lot of your colleagues, you know, were involved in the movement, but also pastored churches. I said, do you feel like you missed your calling to pastor a church? And this will tell you it was a while ago, because he said to me, young man, what you got to understand is I was called to the ministry for the purpose of the movement. He said, some are called to the ministry to pastor churches, some are called to evangelize, some are called to do missions. I was called for the purpose of the movement. He said, because what you got to remember is they went to church too, meaning the people on the other side. They were pastors too. They were elders and Sunday school teachers too. And she said, for me, I saw the movement as a battle to see whose God was God. Was God the God of justice and liberation and equality? Was God the God of Jim Crow, hatred, and division? Two more individuals I want to reference. The late Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, Mr. Fearless, Mr. Civil Rights in Birmingham. Reverend Shuttlesworth once said, he said, the best thing we can do is be a servant of God. It is good to stand up and serve others. And then particularly thinking about confrontation, he said, confrontation isn't bad. Confrontation isn't bad because goodness is supposed to confront evil. And one more individual who talked about faith in the movement. This is his mugshot of Rip Patton, the late Dr. Ernest Rip Patton, who was a freedom rider out of Nashville. And back during the 50th anniversary of the Freedom Rides, we just, recently here celebrated the 60th anniversary of that. But back during the 50th, Oprah was doing a reunion of riders. And, everybody, of course, wants to be on the stage, on the couch, sitting with Oprah, but, not everybody gets to be couch worthy. And so Rip used to share the story of how he got a call about, basically to see if he'd be couch worthy. And he said this employee of the Oprah show just said, oh, I want to ask you a few questions and then I'll let you go. And he said the first question they asked him was, why did you get involved in the movement? Rip says, we were on the phone, so I couldn't see what she was doing. He said, so I said to her, well, do you have a Bible? He said, and she said, yes. I don't know if she did or not. He said, well, turn to Romans 12, 1 and 2. And then Rip said to her, there I read, be not conformed to this world. He said, growing up in the South, I had seen my parents and my grandparents generations before be conformed to the world of Jim Crow segregation. We knew it wasn't right. We knew that it wasn't going to change without resistance, but somebody had to stand up and no longer be conformed to Jim Crow, but transformed. And he said, that's why I got involved. He said, and the person said, okay. He said, well, they said, well, second question, do you feel like you were too young? And he said, well, I said to him, then turn to Isaiah 6 and 8. He said, and there you'll read, then I heard the voice of the Lord say, who shall I send and who will go for us? And I said, here am I, send me. Rip said, you're never too young to get involved when you're doing the right thing. And then finally, the third question that he got, they said, well, but weren't you afraid? And he said to them, well, that's the easiest question you've asked me so far. And this passage of scripture I'm going to give you now, you probably don't even need to turn to it, but I'm going to give you a different version. He says in Psalm 23, he said, I read, yea, though I ride through Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi on a Greyhound bus, and I'll be detained in Parchman prison, I will fear no evil. Rip ended up sitting on the couch at the Oprah show.
Definitely couch worthy.
Last thing I'll say, and then we can open it up for some conversation, is this. Oftentimes I meet people, and as they study this history, they like to play the "if I was around then" game. And what I mean by that is they like to say, well, if I were in Selma, no way anybody would have beat me. If I were in Birmingham, no way somebody would have, sicked a dog on me, and I wouldn't have done this and I wouldn't have done that. Right. And I said, well, first of all, that's a pretty bold statement. You don't know what you would have done for better or worse, but I tell you a good indicator of what you would have done. Whatever you're doing now is what you would have done then. And so if you're not involved now, you wouldn't have been involved then. If you didn't know what was going on, because that's another thing people say, well, I had no idea it was that bad. Guess what? You don't know what's going on right now. I love this woman here. This is the late Dr. Amelia Boynton Robinson. She was the matriarch of the voting rights struggle in Selma, Alabama. She passed away back in 2015 at the age of 104.
Oh my God.
In Selma, they do this thing annually every March to commemorate the Selma to Montgomery March called Jubilee. And one of the things that they do at that time is they recognize the veterans of the movement. And so, being the matriarch of the voting rights struggle, Mrs. Robinson, Dr. Robinson would always get acknowledged. And, I was blessed to be there on many of those occasions, one of which I will always treasure. I can't remember the year. But you know how we do when we honor people, we say things like, I wouldn't be here without you. We stand on your shoulders. Right? But they made a mistake. They gave Dr. Boynton Robinson the mic, and she made her way to the front of the room, and she wasn't there long. She thanked them for the award. But you talk about a mic drop moment. The next thing she said was, you say that you stand on my shoulders. How about you get off my shoulders and do your own work? And then she went right back to her seat.
Fantastic.
And so when I think about this movement history, and I'm going to just stop sharing my screen at this point, that is the challenge for us today when we think about the civil rights movement today is, yes, indeed, we do stand on some shoulders of giants, but they have given us a legacy and lessons that we are called to move forward with in this present time.
Well, it looks like you have raised some questions already, Todd. Usually we
Uh-oh.
don't see Lou before this. So tell us what's happening, Lewis.
Well, we have one comment, says that Jubilee is a beautiful name of a commemorative march. It was a comment. And we have a question. Those civil rights warriors of the 50s and 60s that are still with us today, how do they feel about what's going on today? And I would guess that's a reference to some of the, unfortunately, high profile news headlines about the violence and against people of color in general.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's not one particular answer. I think it's a combination of answers. I think in some ways there is a frustration, a deep disappointment, and a burden that they thought that the battles that they fought, their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren wouldn't have to be fighting those same battles today. I've heard some of them say, particularly like thinking about the education front and how in many ways we're just as segregated as we were pre-Brown, and this feeling that, again, of deep sadness of I thought that we had overcome that one. But at the same time, there is this abiding hope, because I hear them also say, when you sing a song like "Freedom is a Constant Struggle," you can sing that in a couple of ways. You can be very nostalgic and think about, what kind of the march they would have been on, or the mass meeting they would have been at when they sung it. But when you think about those words, it reminds us that in this present moment, freedom is a constant struggle. King used to talk about, that, at the time when evil is continuing to plot and plan, that good needs to be equally aggressive and planning.
It strikes me, Todd, as it's almost cyclical. That the when evil is at its worst, then the good people come forth and battle it, as they did in the 60s. And then it doesn't go away. The evil doesn't go away. It just quiets itself.
Yeah,
and lately it's been enthused and loud. And
sometimes we pretend like, and it's not just the people that we see in the photographs and the film footage out there jeering and holding signs, but we act like that level of hate and that level of intolerance, that level of racism, that after a couple of laws were passed, people said, you know what, I was wrong. Right. And that just went away. It didn't go away. If anything, to use some modern language, it doubled or tripled down.
Yeah.
Right. And so we've got to double and triple down in our commitment to truth and justice.
Yeah. Comments, Lou?
Questions. Let's see. There's a couple of them here. Let's go back up. All right. What recommendations do you have for how we can best continue to educate ourselves?
Well, definitely what is needed in this moment is an informed historical perspective. And, that doesn't mean that now I'm going to tell you, watch these 3 films, read these 4 books, and you've got it. It's a constant learning of this history and reading and watching and thinking, because, I mentioned, that Mark Twain quote, I'm a person of faith. I know that there's nothing new under the sun. But it's hard if you don't know this history, if you don't have an informed historical perspective, to even process current events, right? You believe the narrative that these are isolated events.
Right.
But when you've looked at the history and you know the history, even the interesting thing is I talked about that, if I were their game, that people kind of play. When I'm teaching my students this history and they watch some of the footage and they hear some of the comments that those in opposition to the movement, whether they were everyday people out in the public or leaders make, and they just shake their head. They can't believe it's some of the things coming out of people's mouths. I said, go home tonight and watch the news.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll hear a lot of times the same words, the same phrases. They might be dressed up with a little bit more nicety for 2022. But I know when people in the 1950s were talking about racial integrity, I know what they mean by that word integrity. And now they've adopted it and use it now when they talk about voter integrity.
Right.
And if you don't know the history, sometimes you can find yourself using the very language that's designed to exclude you. Right. Integrity means what I call to be integrity, what I call to be pure, what I call to be right. Again, like I said, but people often ask me, well, what they do say, what should I read? What should I watch? And I want to be fair to that. I do say, maybe begin with, is there a moment or is there a person that really, interests you? And honestly, you could do a deep dive there. When I'm talking with my college students, they are fascinated and taken with the people who were their age. Yeah. Same thing when I'm talking to, the younger students in junior high and high school, when they learn the stories of the Little Rock Nine, when they learn the stories of people like Barbara Johns, who is a high school student, led a school strike, actually not far from here in Farmville, Virginia. These are people like them, the stories that they don't often get to hear. But, even the stories, I said that, 2 names, 4 words, right? Students are fascinated when they find out about the life of activism of Mrs. Parks long before that seat on the bus, which that story still gets mistold, and long after that moment right. on the bus. So even some of the stories we think we know, the more we dig in, we realize we don't even know those as well. And this is just a slice of the African-American experience. We haven't even talked about the ways in which our experiences across ethnicity intersect. And so there's plenty good room, as they say, right. to learn and to study and to realize that we're not talking about your history and my history. We're talking about our shared history.
Well, and can I interject here? I think it's important to know who's telling the history too, because the history is formed oftentimes in the pen of the writer. They want it to take on a certain slant. They want it to look a certain way. And so when this person writes a history textbook or films a documentary or creates some kind of book or telling of a story in history, they tell it from what they would like it to have been sometimes, not always what it was. And so what we have taken as history isn't always the truth.
Oh yeah, so, there's that famous proverb that says, until the lions have their historians, the tales of the hunt are always going to be told by the hunter. Right?
Yes.
I was a broadcast major in my undergrad years. And one of the things I used to love to do was to sit in the studio and edit film. And I remember one time working on a documentary project for some people. And I realized the power that you have in that editing suite. First of all, the power that I had when I was out in the field actually shooting this footage, but then the even greater power I had once I got in that editing suite, I could make this march look as large or as small. I could make it look as extreme or as normal as I wanted to by the tale that I told or didn't tell.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. I want to go back to your high school teacher and that course that she taught, but let's see what Lou has to offer us before we go there.
Actually, apropos, because the next question has to do with high schools and teaching and learning. Are there any standards for teaching about civil rights movements in schools? Do you have any idea of the state of this topic in PA schools? And is it taught in a way And I'm ad-libbing this part.
Mhm.
Is it taught in a way that you think will have an effect on the way people view civil rights, or young people view civil rights?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to the question of Pennsylvania state standards. I can speak anecdotally, not just to my experience, but to some of the experiences and conversations I've had with educators across the state. And it's hit or miss. I think, for some people, they think of the civil rights movement as only having occurred in a certain narrow time period and in a certain region of the country. And so they think if I'm not in that region of the country, we don't need to talk about it.
Right.
But sometimes in that region of the country, they think, well, we know all about it because we're in that region of the country. But the movement was a national story. It occurred down south and it occurred up south in places like Pennsylvania. And I intentionally said up south.
Mhm.
I think the other thing is sometimes people think, well, if my school has great diversity, ethnic diversity, then I should teach it. But if not, then I don't need to. And it doesn't matter to me, the compositional diversity of your school. Again, this is not those people's history and our history. This is American history that in many ways helped to influence the course of world history. I've seen some teachers doing some very creative and innovative things. Even right here in central Pennsylvania, I've been blessed to work with some educators, but I've also seen this backlash, that I referenced at the beginning of this conversation about these faux debates around critical race theory and the 1619 versus the 1776 project. So I've seen some very talented, committed educators basically be reined in and be silenced from teaching a true history because it's going to upset certain stakeholders in the district. Without naming names, it's been very disappointing to see a very dear friend of mine who I think was at the cutting edge of these conversations, not just in terms of race and ethnicity, but gender and class and religion and sexual orientation, basically be silenced as a result of these public pressures, about telling the truth about our past, as though sometimes, loving our country and being truthful, we treat those as like they're mutually exclusive. And again, nothing could be further from the truth.
Absolutely.
Another question from an educator. You spoke about the strength and power of young people in the original civil rights era and their bravery that led to their contributions. How can we inspire young people today to overcome what they are facing right now and fight for the greater good?
Yeah, I tell young people all the time when I talk to them, you show up to do these motivational talks, and then some things that come out of my mouth don't sound so motivational. Well, I tell them, for example, you are not the leaders of tomorrow. And they look at me, I pause, and then I say it again. And I'm like, you're the leaders of today. Sometimes we treat young people like they've got to wait till sometime in the future when they grow up and get a little older, a little smarter to get involved. And again, nothing could be further from the truth. They can make a difference right here, right now. I think, the other thing, and I have to be mindful of this, I sit in a position of some power and some authority. And, I like to believe that I'm a change agent. But sometimes I might not move at a pace in terms of change that younger folk might want to move. And so, if I can convince them, and I don't do this, but I'm saying this is what some do. If I can convince them that they don't have as much power as they do, I can control and keep things in order. But I think it's important that we empower young people. That doesn't mean that we endorse everything that they do, that we lovingly guide and mentor them. I tell them though, in guiding and mentoring, I'll give my opinion when asked, but I'm not going to tell you what to do because, that can be very manipulative, right? But I think the thing I found, honestly, that has been the most empowering for young people is hearing the stories and experiences of other young people, and particularly those that they've never heard before. I think the more exposure they get to that, the more we expand the narrative that we tell of the movement and the characters in that, the more empowering that will be. And I'd be happy. You can put my contact info out there. Or I can mention it at the end. If there are any educators in particular who are saying, well, can you point me to some of those stories, some of those books, some of those films? I'm happy to have that future exchange with people.
That would be great. I know you and I had spoken about one that James Lowen wrote about lies my teacher told me. And going back to that over the last week in preparation for tonight, I was reminded of how many things are kind of drummed into our students as being, this is part of the American story. This is how it was. And it wasn't. That's not how, that's how we created it to be, and some of those things like the Christopher Columbus story, some of those students are now catching on and they themselves are turning it around. But some of the others need a great deal more work,
Well, the thing I think as well, when I was learning this history back in my day, we thank goodness we had Eyes on the Prize. Yes. That was like the go-to resource on VHS, by the way, is how we watched. We had that and we had Roots, right? When I think about what is available to people today, not just young people, just a few, mouse clicks away, the information that's there in terms of video and audio and books and all their varying forms. Honestly, if anything, you can have information overload because there's so much out there. And so, there's plenty of opportunity if one wants to get that informed historical perspective.
Yeah, there's quite a bit there. Are they still teaching those courses that you took in Beaver Falls? Are they still teaching them?
To my knowledge, I've been over here now for 5 years. I came from there to here, and I was actually on the Board of Education over there. I know that the teacher that we had, not the one that I had, who picked up the mantle, had retired, and so it probably is now. I'm not sure if it's 2 years like it was, when I was there. But I hope that, and I do know this, it's not just on, a history or social studies department to do it. There are all kinds of ways that as educators we can get into this conversation. I don't care if you're in math or science or English. There's a way to get in there. If we've got the books you assign or the
examples like Katherine Johnson from NASA in the math class,
Yeah.
It's if you are interested in presenting that balanced picture, the data is out there, the information is out there, and the resources.
And trust me, I want to be fair. I know that educators have all kinds of challenges of only so much time to cover material. I mentioned that I'm teaching rhetoric of the civil rights movement, and I often cringe, because I always have to try to figure out how far back do I start. But knowing the further back I start to give some historical context, I'm going to run out of places to land by the end. And I'm like, all due respect, for example, this year, I went back so far, and we were fortunate to have so many guest speakers that were movement figures, that I only got as far as Selma this year in the voting rights struggle, right? So I said, they're not, my students do know that Martin Luther King was assassinated. I'm not sure if some of them fully know why he was in Memphis and that kind of thing. I said, but I kind of cringe that, there could be, one day they're out there talking to somebody and they mentioned that they had this course at the university on the civil rights movement, and somebody starts quizzing them about Memphis and they don't know anything. And then they say, my professor didn't talk about that. So.
Lou, you have more questions?
I have 2 more. Okay, what do you think we should be marching for today? Reverend Barber's Poor People's Campaign seems like the direct lineal descendant of Kingian nonviolence and the civil rights movement. Are there other descendants to turn to?
Well, it's interesting. We often find ourselves in the civil rights struggle, looking for the next Martin Luther King, right? In fact, I remember years ago, somebody basically tried to explain to me that, Martin Luther King is kind of the leader of Black people, and we're waiting for the next one. And I said to them, who's the leader of white people? And at that time, they named whoever was the president. Now, I found that very interesting because we talked about the president of the United States of America, not the president of the white United States,
right.
of America. So, I think we can fool ourselves if we're only looking for this kind of one big figure. In fact, King himself, in his Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech, acknowledged that the movement was not about him. He was a symbol, but it was really about those ordinary people, right? That's what made the movement. So, as we look around today, I think there are plenty of issues. There are plenty of leaders out there, Reverend Barber being one, but there are also many who are not as well known. At the time of King's death, he talked about the triple evils: militarism, poverty, and racism, and how those intersect. And last I checked, we still have the legacies of militarism and war and violence with us. That's a space to be involved. We still have issues over poverty and inequity in regards to access to healthcare and education and environmental justice. That's still with us. And yes, despite, what some people are trying to distract us with, we've still got racism and other isms. So I think there are plenty of spaces for people to get involved. And, and these intersect as well. When I talked about this movement being a movement of ordinary people who did extraordinary things, the Little Rock Nine didn't set out to say, we're going to go into that school, and then one day they're going to put statues of us, and I'm going to be on a postage stamp, and we're going to get congressional gold medals and the Presidential Medal of Freedom. No, they said, I saw on the news, the Brown versus Board of Education says, I've got a right to go to that school. And going to that school, it's not a better school because it's majority white. It's a better school because that's where the resources are, including my parents' taxes. And somebody's got to go and get our resources.
Right.
And that's why they did what they did. We oftentimes, like I said, will do a couple of things. In honoring King, we dishonor King. We see these larger than life statues of him, and we think, well, I can't speak as eloquently, and I'm not as smart, and I'm not, and so we put him up on a pedestal, but then we don't do anything. And so I think there are plenty of spaces. I like to believe that what I do in my space, doing DE&I work, is making a difference. I'd like to believe that what I do in the classroom is making a difference. I'd like to believe that what I've done being on a board of education for nearly 20 years made a difference. It doesn't mean that all those things get in the headlines. And I think that's the other thing that people need to think about as well. These leaders set out to do what they did because it was right, not because it was popular, because they weren't popular at the time they did it. They didn't set out for the fame and for the platform, if you will. And so I think we need to be careful that that does not become our aim today, the fame, the popularity, and the platform. It's about the proclamation and the cause.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Lou, do you have more?
Looks like I have one more right now. You, which I'm assuming is referencing Todd, you and I both work at the same evangelical institution, must be Todd, of higher learning.
Uh-oh.
What? My Might be a quiz tomorrow.
Yeah.
What is your assessment of the seeming trend towards anti-wokeness in American evangelicalism,
Yeah.
in American evangelicalism,
Yeah.
which seems entirely dismissive of issues of justice as they are contrary to the Christian message? So there's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, and a lot of books
Right.
that I can suggest, and I can't wait to see which one of my colleagues ask me that challenging question. Maybe they'll tell me tomorrow. But no, I think a couple of things. I mentioned that there's nothing new under the sun. Some of the same arguments I hear today against causes such as Black Lives Matter were the same things that were said about King back when he was here. Now many of us pretend like, we love King, and, and again, one of his contemporaries said, well, that's how we are with our heroes. We like them distant and dead, right? There was a time when folk couldn't wait to quote only a portion of the "I Have a Dream" speech for me, for example. And I said, well, you do know that there was many comments that he made in that same speech before he got to the dream portion. And I often wonder if I played some of that, or if I just gave them the text to read that and didn't tell them where it came from, if they would call that being woke and, being a social justice warrior, right? Some of them now have traded in "I Have a Dream" to "they can't wait to tell me about how they read in their church or wherever the letter from a Birmingham jail." Yet at the same time, they come from places that are writing white papers, and I mean that in every sense of the word, about critical race theory. And I say to them, when you wrote that paper, or when you endorsed that paper, or when you supported that paper from your church, do you think you were writing in the spirit of Dr. King, or in the spirit of the 8 clergymen that he was responding to? Right? Again, nothing new under the sun. I was talking to somebody recently, and I told the story of, I guess the other time when you don't quote Mark Twain, you quote Yogi Berra, and it's deja vu all over again. I said, I remember being introduced to this work, particularly of racial reconciliation, and it happened around an officer-involved incident that was recorded, and there was outrage, and then people felt that justice was not done. Books came out talking about this idea of racial reconciliation from an evangelical perspective. It's not that these voices were new, they had been there. We just weren't, giving them publishing contracts. And we did this kind of season of reconciliation for a moment, and then there was a backlash. And if I said, when do you think that was? Some people would think I'd be talking about our present moment. I was like, no, I'm talking about the 1990s and Rodney King and what happened to him in LA. And then the rise in racial reconciliation literature, and then the backlash. But what do we see in 2020? George Floyd, we see this commitment. We see literally some of the same books that were being published in the 90s come back into print.
Right.
And then what do we see? A backlash to that. So, we've seen this before if we've got an informed historical perspective and eyes to see. I guess the last thing I'll say about the question about, kind of the evangelical community. I had someone say to me some time ago, they started off the conversation. They said, the thing I like about you. And, of course, we all want to hear what people like about us, but I was really fascinated by this one because the person didn't even know me. They'd only met me once. They said, what I like about you is you don't talk about social justice. And then they went on with whatever. And so towards the end of the conversation, because I didn't want to ruin lunch, I came back and I said, hey, I want to pick up, what you said you like about me. And they said that I don't talk about social justice. And, yeah. That I like that. That's a good thing. I said, no. I want to not apologize. I want to clarify. I thought when you knew that I was a Christian, that I was concerned about. In fact, my favorite passage of scripture is Micah 6:8. Mine reads kind of like Rip's Bible reads. What does the Lord require of you, Todd, but to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly? And so, I've had people try to tell me, well, you're misunderstanding, you're misinterpreting that scripture. We've got a way of making the simple very complex. I think I simply understand I'm to do justice and to be about justice. I'm to love mercy, and I'm to walk humbly, with my God. I think if I can do those three things in a day, that's not a bad day.
That's right. That's right. It's not a bad day. What do you hear back from your students, Todd, when you, in your class on the rhetoric of the civil rights movement? Do you hear? Now, maybe this is a foolish question, because in a college, obviously, people are going to sign up for the classes they want to take. But do you hear backlash? Do you get backlash from any of your students?
It's a good thing I'm done doing my lectures now, and the students are doing group projects. So I'm going to say, now you've just, wished that on me for my last week of classes coming up next week. But I have not experienced it yet. What I teach is an elective. I think that's part of it. People kind of select to come in there, but that's no guarantee. I mean, I talk to colleagues all the time who teach in spaces where when you start telling these truths that don't line up with the misinformation or the lies that their teachers had told them before, there is resistance, there is pushback. The number of conversations I've had with people who are angry over critical race theory, but can't tell you what it is.
Right.
But
I'll know it when I see it.
Yeah, I know when I see it, and I know I shouldn't like it, kind of thing. But fortunately, I have not. I think the kinds of things that I get from students are just this heaviness, and I mean it in both a positive and a negative way, of hearing stories that they've never heard before. Like, one of the activities we do the very first day of class is I put a timeline on the board, and I may start with, let's say, 1619 and go right to 2022 and say, when you hear the phrase civil rights movement, and this is a timeline, put up here what you think. Of course, everybody rushes in and puts up Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Jackie Robinson, March on Washington. Even though it's a timeline, they don't put it in chronological order sometimes. But
they might have the right century.
It gets very, very thin, though, right? And then I tell them, I was like, yeah, we're going to talk about some of these things, but there's going to be so much more. And then I don't often have the time to do it. I mentioned I didn't even get the time to get to Memphis this year. But I will come back at the end of the course and put that same timeline up and say, now fill it in. And what they've been exposed to, names that they didn't know before.
That's great.
It's just been, and they marvel at their own, learning. And so, I think the fact that, in a class of 25 people, the majority will have heard of Emmett Till. They will have heard of Emmett Till, but they won't know the depth of that story and why it was so impactful. And then they've had a chance to read about it, to see a film about it, to meet with the documentary filmmaker who made that film. Now they're never, gonna not know who Emmett Till was and why that was so impactful.
Right. Is there one individual or one group of individuals throughout the highlight of the civil rights movement in the 60s and 50s and 60s that stands out to you as being the one that you really feel was the most powerful or the strongest or made the biggest impression, or who comes forward for you?
I'm laughing, Lisa, because you're going to get me in trouble with what I said before when people ask me, do I have a favorite place?
Yeah.
Now you're going to ask me to name a favorite person, and
well, not necessarily favorite, but
okay, all right. I was hoping not, because this is recorded. Some of them are going to see this and say you didn't name me. I mean, honestly, I tell people, if you want to see something funny, you should watch me the first time I'm on the phone talking to one of these figures. Because, I get the idea of hero worship. These are, when are you going to take a class in history and then actually meet the people that you're
And
studying?
meet them,
That's
right,
mind-blowing stuff. But I
right.
try to act all calm, cool, and collected, when I'm talking. But I'm like a kid at Christmas jumping up and down. Just so many of them who've spoken into my life, both from what they did at that moment in history to what they continue to do throughout their lives. I guess for me, probably an individual that I find myself quoting more often, because he was kind of like that last connection to those big leaders would be the late Congressman John Lewis.
Yeah.
And just the way in which he carried himself in public and in private. I was fortunate enough to be in his presence in some of those more private moments, when you really get to see who somebody is, and he's even greater than what you saw publicly,
Right.
And so, I mentioned the challenge that we're losing these authentic voices, and that has been tough. There have been so many people that I learned about, never thought that I would get the opportunity to meet, and met them, forged close relationships like family, and now they're gone. And that can be difficult, when you go to Montgomery and Mrs. Carr is no longer there. When you go to Memphis and Reverend Billy Kyles is no longer there. When I go to Nashville and Dr. Patton is no longer there. But I decided to look at it a different way. I'm blessed that however long the season was, that I got to meet those people, and that they poured into my life. And hopefully in some way, I even got to maybe pour into theirs a little bit and let them know that this struggle, that they invested themselves in all those years ago, that I'm a fruit of that. And so, like I said, there's not a day that goes by that I don't think about the spaces that I occupy and the people who made that happen. One of the pictures, my favorite pictures that I have, two that I have in my office. One is my father in an elementary school classroom in the 1940s, pre-Brown, integrated classroom in Western Pennsylvania. And the other is a picture of my son, his grandson, at his high school graduation. I'm embracing him. I got to actually speak at his graduation. He was the first African-American valedictorian in the history of that same school district that his grandfather was in. And I remind my son, while I'm very, very proud of him, I was like, you weren't the first smart African-American to come through here. I was like, you were the first one that had an opportunity and had some of those barriers and those things that used to disqualify people, taken down. But that further then obligates you to make sure that those barriers don't come back up and that new ones aren't erected.
Mm-hmm. That's one thing that I get very concerned about, that there are new barriers being erected all the time. And I know that you said frequently this evening that there's nothing new under the sun. And you can take some solace in that sometimes, and other times that can be very discouraging. Which way does that hit you? Do you get discouraged when you look at the current climate?
No, I won't lie that there have been things that have happened in the last few years that I just find myself sometimes without words.
Yeah.
Just shake my head in disbelief. And the way I describe it is, I like a variety of types of music, including the blues, but I can't listen to the blues all day, every day.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I can't let the blues have me, I guess is the way I think about that. And so I see it as motivation to not be complacent, to not think that we have overcome, but yet that we are continually overcoming.
Mm-hmm. That's a good way to put it. Continually overcoming. Yeah. Do we have one last question, Lou?
I don't have a question. I have a closing comment from me, and something that happened to me back in the mid 2000s, and I tell this story with great shame, but it's for a purpose. It was at Walmart, and I was in one lane. You know, back in the day before there was self-checkout.
Ooh, way back. Yeah.
All of 15 something years ago. There was a lovely woman in the next lane, woman of color, young woman, younger than I was, probably. If I had to guess, I would say in the early to mid 20s. And behind her were, and I don't like to profile, but these were obvious rednecks of some sort. Cut off sleeves, hats, and chew, and and not that there's anything wrong with that at all, except health wise. And a young lady. There were three of them, and they were saying things to this woman of color, this Black woman, about go back where you came from. What are you doing? And she's like, I'm from Maryland. And they continued, well, then go back there. We don't want you here.
Mm-hmm.
And I was enraged, very enraged. But I was also became afraid.
Mm.
And I didn't, my first instinct was to say something, and I didn't. And my comment and the moral to this, I believe, and possibly one of the pills to make equality, to get closer to everybody being equal and everybody being treated with dignity, is don't not say anything.
Mm-hmm.
Look out for your safety, but honestly, I'm a big dude. I was bigger than both these guys, and it was a public place. And I could tell by the expression on this young woman's face that she was in fear, in great fear. And I regret to this day that I did not stand up or at least comfort her or say, here, come with me, I'll take you out to your car. So that's my comment is, if you can and you have the fortitude, don't let these incidents slide by.
First of all, thank you for your candor in sharing that story, because sometimes we only share those stories where it's obvious that we're the hero in the telling of the story. But I as I listen to you, I tell people, so I'm not looking for allies in the struggle. An ally is like doing me a favor. I'm looking for people who realize that their freedom is bound up in my freedom. Mm-hmm. And that's, what people like Viola Liuzzo and Joan Mulholland and Jonathan Daniels and James Reeb. And if you don't know those names, there's some homework for you. That's what they were. They realized that their freedom was bound up in my freedom. And I think the other thing that I would say, I think you're right, that John Lewis again says, don't be afraid to make good trouble, to be wise in making good trouble. Mm-hmm. But I would not want people to walk away thinking, and I'm well aware of those kinds of persons you described, but I've had more of my interactions not with the person who's that stereotype. I've had more of mine with people who come in nice dresses and business suits. Yeah. Who lynch me with policy, right? And not the mean words. Those are mm-hmm. obvious. I really wrestle with those who think they're doing me a favor, which when the way in which they talk about or disqualify and discount anybody who's not like them. Yeah. And I won't even bore you with all of the stories, even that have happened here in Central PA, up south, in the 5 years time that I've been here. But again, while we think about the civil rights movement today, I'm not a fan of the phrase post civil rights. I don't think we're over it. I don't think we'll ever be over it on this side. But while we're here, what are the issues that we need to be finding a way to get in a way.
And there are quite a few of those, particularly when you live up south. Particularly then.
Yeah.
So Todd, thank you so much for tonight. I really appreciate your time, and I'm gonna try to ask this very politely, but could I please ask a favor and
Yes.
have you email us any book suggestions or movie suggestions that you think would be good? I mean, I know you said you can't say watch these 3 books or watch these 3 movies and read these 4 books and you'll be good. And I know that that's not the case, but there are some that I think it would be a good place for people to start. So any suggestions like that you'd have, if you could send them to me, and between Lou and I will get them posted so that people have a ready place to come to look for good material that is the true history, that is
Sure,
not.
I'd be happy to do that, and I made a promise earlier, and so I'm going to follow through on that. If anybody just wants to email me, you can reach me at the university, and my email address is tallen, TALLEN @messiah.edu. And if you forget all of that, just go to the Messiah University webpage and put my name in there, and my pretty face should pop up
Right
somewhere.
up. Yeah, that's how we did it. And we will include your contact information when we post this as well. So that would be great. Thank you again. I really appreciate your time and your expertise and advice tonight. And I do have a couple of announcements before we close, just keeping in mind the YWCA's mission is the elimination of racism and the empowerment of women. We've got a couple of things coming up in the very near future, like tomorrow. Tomorrow evening, we'll have a Facebook viewing party for the documentary 13th. I think we did this last year about this time, and I know I signed up to see it again because it was that good. It's not tomorrow, it's Friday. I'm a day ahead of myself. So it'll be Friday, April 22nd. Go to the YWCA Facebook page or the YWCA website, which is ywcahanover.org, and you'll be able to sign up for that. And Lou,
registration required to receive a link to view.
Yes, right. Yep, you need to have that. And on Sunday afternoon, Sunday the 24th, this Sunday at 2 p.m., we will be holding a peaceful rally to show our support for the YWCA's mission to stand against racism. And that will be at 2 o'clock in Hanover Square. So those are 2 things you can do now over the next 72 hours to get involved and to make your voice heard. And other than that, just as we sign off, I want to remind you, come back next month. We don't have a date or a topic set just yet. We're still working on that. But if you check with Lou through the YWCA Hanover website, you'll find out that both the date for our next enlightening conversation and a topic. And just a personal note, if you have a topic that you would like to see us cover, please let us know. You can email us via that website. You can drop a note on our Facebook page. You can pick up the phone and call. Anything, anyway, will work. But we'd really like to be able to cover the topics that you find important, because that's why we're doing this, to have these conversations so that you and us, that we can all grow together. So that's it for tonight. Again, thank you, Todd. Thank you, Lou. And we'll sign off for tonight.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Signing